we are sure that we can make a positive contribution to the rights of the Human Rights Council. This is why we're running for election as a member for the period 2024 to 2026. We're only too aware of the challenges inherent to this, but we're firmly committed to defending human rights, and we're also convinced of the crucial role played by multilateralism. Were Timor-Leste to be elected for the first time, our membership of the Council would give the Council a new view, and it would also strengthen the Council's representativeness by including members from different regions and backgrounds. Thank you very much. We count on your support. Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
To the distinguished Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic, I invite him to address the Council. His Excellency, Mr. Jan Lipavsky. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to address the Human Rights Council for me for the first time. Priorities of the new Czech government indisputably lie on the side of the protection and promotion of human rights, both at home and worldwide. I would like to express special thanks for the work carried out by High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet and her office. The Czech Republic has and always will support her independence and the comprehensive human rights mandate. I wish to reaffirm that the Czech Republic will continue to provide voluntary financial contributions to the High Commissioner Office, and I hope that others will follow suit. Mr. President, we attach great importance to supporting adequate and timely responses to human rights violations and abuses wherever they occur. We believe that it is the core business of the Council. All country situations should be treated on equal footing without discrimination. Given the extraordinary circumstances, allow me to address the human rights situation of our utmost concern in Ukraine. Slava Ukraine, glory to Ukraine, can be heard these days all over the civilized world that is witnessing an unprovoked, unprecedented military aggression of Russia against Ukraine, a flagrant violation of international law and the core principles of the international rule-based global security. We all admire the impressive bravery of the Ukrainian people fighting back against Putin's Russia. Ukrainians are not and should not be alone. The Czech Republic and other countries are stepping up their support to Ukraine. Drastic times call for drastic measures and concrete deeds and actions. Political statements are no longer enough. Russia and Belarus have been systematically fighting all people who made a choice of liberty, dignity and democracy. This is true for inside their own countries as well as for the so-called close neighborhood. The Czech Republic has always advocated for democracy and expressed support and solidarity with people fighting for it. Now, more than even before, we don't stop repeating that we are standing firmly by the Ukrainian people. We deplore loss of human lives, and we are denouncing all human rights violations on the Ukrainian territory by the Russian military. According to the latest figures from the Ukraine Ministry of Health, Russian occupation forces killed 352 civilians, including 14 children. Conducting an offensive operation in Ukraine, the Russian occupiers used methods of combat prohibited by international humanitarian law, such as wearing uniforms of the Ukraine military police, stealing ambulances and police cars, or using children and women as human shields. In many cities and towns, apartment buildings and infrastructure facilities have been massively damaged by occupiers' shelling. In places like Kyiv, Kharkiv and elsewhere in Ukraine, every night people sleep in shelters, women give birth in metro stations, while trying to stay safe from Russian bombs and rockets. Leaders, their associates and military commanders of Russia and its closest ally and collaborators, Belarus, must be held accountable. Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko will lose this war. We hope that the Russian and Belarusian government will be then once again be led by people who believe in democracy and human rights. Mr. President, the Czech Republic is grateful to you and the whole Bureau for steering the Council towards a prompt and rightful reaction to that full-scale, horrifying assault of Russia on Ukraine. We call on Russia to end the unjustified attack, end the violence, withdraw its forces from Ukraine, and start respecting international law and human rights law. With that in mind, the Czech Republic has supported the Ukraine initiative to call an urgent debate on Russia attack on Ukraine and establish an independent international commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights. While we are mostly preoccupied with the situation in Ukraine, we must also not forget our human rights situation of concern around the world. In China, fundamental freedoms such as freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief are being severely restricted. We are seriously concerned about the human rights violation against minorities, especially in Xinjiang, Tibet, and in Mongolia. We urge the Chinese authorities to close down the political education camps, and we call for an immediate release of all human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers who have been detained for exercising their basic rights. In Cuba, hundreds of people are being detained simply for expressing themselves freely. Many of them have already been harshly sentenced. Such actions by the Cuban government to repress, punish, and intimidate all forms of dissent and public criticism are unacceptable. We are also seriously concerned about the situation in Venezuela, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. The Human Rights Council must continue addressing these situations. Ladies and gentlemen, let us never forget why we are here. Not for procedures, not for speeches. We are here to try our best and help people in this world who were not fortunate enough, whose human rights are violated, whose human rights we have to fight for. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Y ahora tengo el honor.
It's now my honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mario Adolfo Bucaro Flores, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Guatemala. You have the floor, Your Excellency. President, I'm honored to address the Human Rights Council on behalf of Alejandro Matei, President of Guatemala, who recently appointed me as Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'm particularly pleased to see that Ambassador Federico Villegas has been elected to the presidency of the Council. We offer you our full support. The Guatemalan Constitution emphasizes that states must protect life. This is something that our government honors, and we ensure full protection and enforcement of human rights. This is something which underpins decisions taken in various fields of life. Alejandro Matei took office less than 2 years ago, but I'm pleased to be able to share some of our achievements, despite the fact that we face difficult times in view of the terrible COVID-19 pandemic. I would also like to tell you about some of our plans for this year. We've made essential achievements in responding to the needs of our people so that we can generate development at community level, particularly amongst the most vulnerable segments of our population, notably women, children, young people, older persons, indigenous peoples and migrants. They're all an important part of our social fabric. Guatemala, holistic care for migrants is a priority. Migrants need special policies so that we can address the deep-seated causes of irregular migration. With this in mind, the holistic development plan for Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua and Southeast Mexico has been adopted. Our country is a country of origin, transit and return of migrants, but our principles have always been to focus on human rights, in particular the human rights of our migrants. Regardless of migratory status, we have extended our consular services so that we can promote regular migration, notably through temporary job opportunities for our fellow citizens. And also we try to ensure that those transiting through our country can regularise their situation. Our government promotes the right to development of indigenous peoples through an intercultural approach. And this is the spirit which has characterised citizens' participation. We ensure that we respect ancestral rights and the Maya Cosmo vision. We make an appeal to all states to show full commitment to the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the human rights of indigenous peoples, particularly the corresponding resolution adopted by this council. We continue to adopt measures to promote the participation in the United Nations of indigenous peoples and that their rights be universally recognised. In the same way, we're delighted to see that a permanent forum for persons of African descent has been set up and that we're working towards the adoption of a declaration which will fully respect the rights of persons of African descent. President, the terrible consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic has brought new challenges. International cooperation and solidarity are absolutely vital if we're to overcome the pandemic, which has rolled back human development by decades. We also need to make sure that no one's left behind. Challenges are an opportunity for growth. Guatemala would like to thank all friendly countries which have provided unconditional assistance in vaccinating our people. Our country has always had a multilateral vocation. Guatemala will not stop, and we have adopted an economic recovery plan which strives to promote foreign trade and also to bring in more tourists to our country. President, Guatemala attaches great importance to strengthening the rule of law. The government respects international and national legal orders by ensuring the separation and independence of the branches of power. So my country respects its commitments as a founder member of the United Nations. We're fully committed to strengthening United Nations entities, and we'll continue to work for an open cooperation with the Council's mechanisms and those of the Inter-American system. I would also like to emphasize that Guatemala appreciates the support received from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Our country office was set up 17 years ago at the request of our state with a view to national capacity building. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be remiss of me not to mention the situation faced by the brother country of Ukraine. The Guatemalan government vehemently condemns the unilateral recognition by Russia of the so-called separatist republics of Ukraine. This is an act which violates the principles of international law, Ukraine's integrity, and it has also led to the use of military force on Ukrainian lands. Guatemala is a pacifist country. We respect international law, so we make a call to have diplomacy prevail so that we can prevent this conflict from escalating, because it threatens international peace and security. And I would also like to highlight the people who have been affected by this escalation of the conflict. I'd like to urge everyone to look for a peaceful solution to this terrible crisis. This must respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights, and the safety of all countries. I'd like to round off by reiterating that Guatemala believes that prevention is vital for avoiding human rights violations wherever they may occur, and to ensure that multilateralism is effective, relevant, and necessary. This is done through the UN mechanisms and by recognising the challenges we face. Cooperation, and particularly the unity of our countries, will enable the member states to overcome the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Excellency.
To give the floor to His Excellency Mr. G.L. Peiris, Minister for Foreign Relations of Sri Lanka, to address the Council. Thank you.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka is an active participant in the multilateral framework to realize the promotion and protection of human rights. Fundamental rights are embodied in our Constitution, progressively advanced through our democratically elected organs of government, and enforced through our independent judiciary. Despite multiple challenges we have faced from terrorism, we have restored peace, security, and the rule of law throughout our country. Our democratic traditions and independent institutions ensure free and fair elections at regular intervals through universal adult franchise. We will further advance the considerable progress we have made in post-conflict recovery and healing. For this, Mr. President, we have put in place domestic institutions for reconciliation, accountability, and social justice. Through this Council, we have completed 3 mutually beneficial universal periodic reviews, engaged in constructive dialogue with the treaty bodies, welcomed special procedures mandate holders, and held frank and open discussions with domestic and international interlocutors. We have benefited from the considerable expertise available with the United Nations on human rights, including through its technical cooperation and capacity building programs. Through the UN country team, we value the ongoing support to our domestic processes on reconciliation and achievement of sustainable development goals. Through this cooperative interaction, and in line with our domestic framework and international obligations, we continue to ensure the promotion and protection of human rights and social justice for all our citizens, irrespective of ethnic and religious identity and political affiliation. Mr. President, despite the economic setbacks due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we continue to ensure our people's right to development. Sri Lanka has improved its global rank by 7 positions according to the latest SDG report. We appreciate the contribution made by our civil society partners through their extensive grassroots level outreach and undoubted expertise. As a developing member state of the international community, we brace ourselves to face the further adverse economic consequences of crises such as the pandemic and the unraveling conflict in Europe, which will impact on our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. President, we are today in a period of review of the work of the Council. We reflect on whether the Council has been successful in overcoming the credibility gap that led to the downfall of its predecessor commission. The multilateral architecture for the implementation of human rights was progressively developed in the last decades. Consensus was forged on key principles which we consider sacrosanct, such as that the promotion and protection of human rights should be guided by the principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity based on the sovereign equality of member states. UNGA Resolution 60/251 and HRC Resolutions 5/1 and 5/2 also decided that the working methods of the Council shall be transparent, fair, and impartial, and shall enable genuine dialogue. In March 2021, the Council voted on Resolution 46/1, which was tabled without the consent of Sri Lanka as a country concerned. The consideration of this matter polarized and politicized this forum in a startling departure from the mandate which the UN General Assembly originally conferred on this Council. Operative Para 6 of this resolution refers to a so-called evidence-gathering mechanism, a measure that was strongly opposed by a number of countries. Such initiatives create disharmony both in the domestic and in the international arenas. It creates obstacles to reconciliation efforts, breeds hatred by reopening past wounds, and polarizes society. Mr. President, member states have mandated this Council and its Secretariat with a truly extensive array of helpful working methods to assist governments in the promotion and protection of human rights. Sri Lanka has participated actively and constructively in those aspects of the Council's work that have been productive and beneficial, and which have helped to ensure that our people live safer, longer, and more dignified lives. We reject, however, those that are punitive, politicized, divisive, unhelpful, and initiated due to extraneous reasons. Mr. President, as elsewhere in the world, we endeavor to strike a just balance between human rights and national security when dealing with terrorism. Sri Lanka is convinced that counterterrorism legislation must secure and protect the rights of persons subject to investigation, detention, and trial, and must not restrict democratic freedoms such as the freedom of expression. With these objectives in view, I recently presented a bill in the Parliament of Sri Lanka, which is an initial step in amending the Prevention of Terrorism Act 43 years after it was promulgated. We take particular objection to the use of voluntary funding, which has the necessary consequence of undermining objectivity and detachment. Against this background, Sri Lanka once again reiterates its view that the evidence-gathering mechanism established under Operative Para 6 of Resolution 46/1 is unhelpful to the people of Sri Lanka, will polarize Sri Lankan society, and adversely affect economic development, peace, and harmony in my country at a challenging time. It is an unproductive drain on member state resources at a time of severe financial shortfalls across the entire multilateral system, including the High Commissioner's Office. Mr. President, on the 4th of March, the Council will meet in an interactive dialogue on Sri Lanka. I look forward to sharing with you some thoughts on the written update on my country, Sri Lanka. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Agora,
I now have the honour of giving the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Esmeralda Mendonça, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Angola. You have the floor, Your Excellency. President, Excellencies, and esteemed representatives of member states, I'm particularly honoured to be afforded the privilege of taking part in this high-level debate, given the importance that the Republic of Angola attaches to the work of the Human Rights Council, as well as the recognition, promotion and protection of human rights and principles throughout the world. Excellencies, the Angolan Constitution is aligned with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, in promoting and defending fundamental rights and freedoms as a priority, and also in strengthening democracy, the rule of law, peace and development. The Angolan government has undertaken constant efforts to protect these principles. They include a program for judicial reform. This has led to a partial constitutional revision, which has ushered in some amendments which will strengthen our democracy and rule of law. It also strengthens the principles of the separation of powers and the interdependence of the functions of the different branches of power. It also will allow greater respect for fundamental freedoms such as free, fair, secret and direct universal elections. This reform will also greatly strengthen our judicial system in Angola and will provide a better response to the need for social justice and for building an open democracy in which all citizens can participate. This comes at a time when the country is preparing to hold the 4th general elections, which for the first time will allow Angolans living abroad to take part. This process will also allow then these citizens to exercise their rights openly. President, in the area of human rights, I'd like to underscore the fact that in April of 2020, Angola launched the National Human Rights Strategy for the period 2020 to 2022, as well as the National Action Plan, with the issue of human rights having been raised in rank to an issue of national security. I would also like to emphasize that in view of the success of the National Human Rights Strategy, the government has been working with civil society. This effort has led to an increase in the number of NGOs working on human rights issues. Their number has increased from 300 to 800 over the past 5 years. I'm also delighted to be able to inform you that in under 2 years of the strategy having been in force, we have managed to implement over 80% of the planned actions for this period. This has enabled us to establish 171 local human rights committees. They're responsible for promoting, protecting and defending human rights in the various provinces, municipalities and communes in our country. In line with the World Programme for Human Rights Education, our government has been rolling out a national strategy in this area. This has included the signing of protocols with 15 universities for human rights education to be provided in universities. Angola also recently launched the National Human Rights Plan. The aim of this plan is to highlight outstanding efforts to promote, protect and defend human rights by individuals or legal entities. We believe this is the best way of raising society's awareness about the importance of human rights. Part of this strategy is the presidential initiative called the Reconciliation Plan in memory of the victims of political conflicts. This is a plan which is led by the President of the Republic, João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço. It includes a public apology to the nation for the tragic events which bereaved thousands of Angolans in the past. The government has also undertaken a number of other actions in the area of gender equality, the inclusion of vulnerable groups in the education system, so that we can eradicate school dropout. We've also adopted policies to provide health services at municipal level, notably by speeding up the building of new health centres, hospitals and other healthcare facilities. President, Strengthening economic, social and cultural rights is one of the Angolan government's priorities. In this area, our country has undertaken a number of programs with a view to making families' lives more dignified. We are also striving to prevent vulnerability, and we're working to reduce poverty rates. I'd particularly like to highlight in this regard the programme to strengthen social protection through social cash transfers, which goes by the name of Kwenda. The aim of this programme is to support poor or vulnerable families through social cash transfers by including them in the productive economy, and also by providing support to the entrepreneurial activities of families that live in certain municipalities. This initiative goes hand in hand with the multi-sectoral plan for municipal action, which focuses on programs and actions to promote holistic development and respond to the challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. President, I'd like to round off by reiterating Angolan's commitment to the Human Rights Council and the High Commissioner's work, as well as the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you very much. Thank you, Excellency.
Y ahora le doy la palabra.
I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Faisal Mekdad, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates in the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor.
السيد رئيس مجلس حقوق
Mr. President of the Human Rights Council, ladies and gentlemen, the Syrian Arab Republic believes in constructive dialogue, respective of the privacy of states and societies, their cultural and civilizational diversity. We stress the importance of the Human Council to conduct its role as agreed upon by member states of the United Nations when it established the Council. This role is based on constructive dialogue in dealing with human rights issues as a system of interdependent and indivisible rights in all countries without discrimination, and on technical cooperation to help states build their capacities in accordance with their national priorities. Unfortunately, we are still witnessing a stubbornness by Western countries to exploit the Council and its mechanisms to impose their double standards in dealing with human rights, and to accuse and stigmatize some member states of violating human rights and use them as a pretext to interfere in their internal affairs. The politicized resolutions targeting Syria under the pretext of human rights prove that the real goal is to provide cover for certain states that practice aggression and occupation and support terrorism, and to use it against the Syrian Arab Republic. Just to remind you, UK, which is leading such initiatives against Syria in this council, has spent $4 billion on disinformation campaigns that targeted Syria. This is according to what was revealed by the British media. Hence, we hope that the Council will reconsider these practices and end the work of politicized mechanisms that it had established without the consent of the concerned state. These operate with a semi-open mandate in implementation of politicized and non-consensual resolutions adopted by the Council based on campaigns of systemic misinformation against Syria. The Syrian Arab Republic since 2011 has been facing a systematic war of terrorism that has been recruited and used from abroad to undermine its stability, unity, and territorial integrity, in addition to foreign occupation of parts of its national soil. With the continued occupation by Turkish and American forces and terrorists armed with groups and separatist SDF militias continue to commit gross and systemic crimes and violations of human rights to serve the interests of their operators and supporters, not to mention the practices of the Turkish occupation and its implementation of Turkification policy and a systemic demographic change on Syrian territory. It is also using water as a weapon and tool for political blackmail and collective punishment of the population. These challenges have posed and still have grave repercussions on human rights in Syria. These are further exacerbated by the imposition of unilateral coercive measures on Syrian people by the United States and the European Union, not to mention the theft of natural and economic resources to deprive the Syrian people of their national wealth. The intensification expansion of the scope of unilateral coercive measures, especially during COVID-19 pandemic, has led to targeting the Syrian citizen for their livelihood and violating their basic rights, foremost of which is the rights to life, health, food, education and development. These immoral measures escalated to unprecedented level, where they constituted a form of economic terrorism that seeks to prolong the crises, obstructing the recovery and reconstruction efforts and preventing the return of the displaced to their homeland and homes. While the Syrian government faces these challenges, it continues to assume its responsibilities and duties to preserve national sovereignty, liberate Syrian territory from foreign occupation, combat terrorist armed groups, and preserve the security and life of its citizens and meet their basic needs. In assurance of its desire to fulfill its international obligations and belief in international cooperation based on the Charter of the United Nations, the Syrian Arab Republic has recently concluded the discussion of its third national report within the framework of the UPR mechanism and is currently studying the recommendation addressed to it. The national report has shed the light on the efforts of the Syrian state within available capabilities in the field of rehabilitating areas that it liberated from terrorism, and to protect the rights of its citizens and meet their basic needs, as well as address the COVID-19 pandemic challenges, as well as sustainable developing goals. Syrians return voluntarily in dignity to their homes as we attempt to do so. Unfortunately, these efforts are still faced by some negative positions that prioritize political agendas over humanitarian considerations and seek to create stressful living conditions for Syrians through an economic siege that prevents them from food, medicine, oil, energy, and impose political conditionalities on United Nations humanitarian agencies to impede their cooperation with the Syrian state in order to overcome the economic and livelihood consequences of the crisis and move forward from relief into development. Mr. President, Syria is determined to cleanse its territory of the remnants of terrorism and foreign occupation and to confront the agendas and practices of the separate SDF militia that threaten with U.S. political and military support the unity of Syrian territory and people. At the same time, Syria will keep moving in national reconciliation and settlement, which are accomplishing remarkable progress in different regions of Syria, with the issuance of the 21 pardon decrees by President Bashar al-Assad since 2011. Thousands of Syrians have benefited from these decrees, and in order to return to their normal lives, Syria continues to take the necessary steps to facilitate the return of the displaced to their country in implementation of the outcomes of Refugee Return Conference and follow-up meetings in Damascus. Syria is also committed to a political process led and owned by Syrians, facilitated by the United Nations with no external interference or preconditions. While preparations are underway to hold the 7th round of committee meetings in Geneva, I reiterate that the committee is the sole owner of its decisions and the exclusive decision maker to determine its course of action and the outcomes it may conclude. The success of this committee requires adherence to its references, non-interference in its affairs by any party, and respect for the exclusive right of the Syrian people to decide the future of their country. In conclusion, the Syrian Arab Republic affirms its inalienable right to recover the occupied Syrian Golan and its categorical rejection of unilateral measures taken by the Israeli occupying power to consolidate its occupation and escalate its settlement practices. Syria affirms that the occupation's practices and unilateral measures are null and void, have no legal effect, as they constitute a violation of UN resolution, including Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981. Syria renews its condemnation of the gross and systematic violations of human rights committed by the Israeli occupation forces and settlers gangs in occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and in the occupied Syrian Golan, and of its racist practices that violate United Nations resolutions, including those of the Human Rights Council. Syria reiterates its firm support for the right of the Palestinian people to establish their independent state with Jerusalem as its capital, on the borders of June 4, 1967, and to guarantee the right of refugees to return in implementation of relevant UN Nations resolution, and its support for the liberation of the remaining occupied Lebanese territories. Thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm now honoured to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Elena Mateusz-Kida, Minister of Justice, Constitutional and Religious Affairs of Mozambique. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Sua Excelência Presidente do Conselho.
Your Excellency, President of the Human Rights Council, distinguished delegations, esteemed representatives of civil society, ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me at the outset to personally and on behalf of the Mozambican government extend our warmest greetings to you, President, and the members of the Human Rights Council Bureau for your excellent stewardship of this session. We would also like to express our appreciation for the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and her whole team for the most valuable work that they have carried out in defending and promoting human rights throughout the world. Excellencies, on the 4th of May of last year, Mozambique underwent its third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review, with an interactive dialogue among peers, which led to the adoption of the report on Mozambique's third cycle in September at the Human Rights Council. There were some 266 recommendations made by member states. 236 were accepted and 30 noted by my government. In view of these commitments, the Mozambican government has undertaken every effort to fully and effectively implement not only the recommendations made during the UPR, but also other recommendations which have arisen from other human rights reports, and in order to ensure the protection of citizens' rights enshrined in our constitution. In this context, Mozambique intends to carry out the following actions. At a government level, we'll be creating an interministerial group on human rights and international humanitarian law. This is part of our follow-up to the UPR. We're just awaiting for the Council of Ministers to adopt the implementing regulation for that. When it comes to voluntary principles on security and human rights, we're creating a national working group which will comprise government institutions, private sector and civil society, so that we can promote a multi-sectoral dialogue to implement those voluntary principles. And also, when it comes to following up on the UPR, we've undertaken efforts to draw up a national action plan for implementing the recommendations for the period between 2020 and 2025. Excellencies, we held a round table on the voluntary principles on security and human rights in Mozambique. This charts a new chapter in the history of human rights and citizenship in our country. This was an absolute watershed in promoting an open interactive dialogue between state institutions, civil society and the business sector on fully implementing the voluntary principles on security and human rights in Mozambique so that we can improve governance in the area of human rights. And we'll particularly focus on the Cabo Delgado province in the far north. With this in mind, Mozambique will offer the United Nations its humble experience in preventing, mediating and resolving conflicts through dialogue. This is a tool which warrants the support of our President, Felipe Jacinto Nyusi. Excellencies, I would like to round off by expressing our pleasure at being able to take part in this session. We'd like to reiterate our unwavering commitment to promoting and protecting human rights. They are the essential mission of this important United Nations body. We know that even though we've made a number of efforts as described above, there are still challenges for creating a favourable environment so that human rights and citizenships can be fully exercised. We need to ensure that we uphold regional and international commitments in the area of human rights and the principles of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much, Excellency.
To Her Excellency Ms. Yvonne Daussa, Minister of Justice of Namibia. You have the floor. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is a great honor to address the 49th session of the Human Rights Council on behalf of the Republic of Namibia and to join this hybrid high-level engagement in person. We are meeting at a time when states around the world continue to grapple with the devastating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. While remarkable progress has been made in the development of effective vaccines, vaccination rates remain severely low in much of the developing world. Namibia is therefore pleased to note that part of the discussions at this session will be dedicated towards finding answers on how to ensure equitable and affordable access to vaccines for all countries. Namibia particularly looks forward to hearing best practices on tackling misinformation which perpetuates public apprehension and vaccine hesitancy. It is commendable that notwithstanding the challenges presented by the pandemic, the Human Rights Council continues to respond to a myriad of global human rights issues promptly and adequately. These efforts to promote the universal respect for the protection of all human rights reaffirms the indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated nature of human rights as sacrosanct. Namibia therefore extends our sincere gratitude to the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights and other stakeholders for the remarkable efforts undertaken during these difficult times and look forward to open dialogue in the spirit of mutual trust when addressing the issues facing us as a global community. Mr. President, during our tenure, Namibia actively engaged with the work of the Council. We did so in a spirit of cooperation with members and observer states as well as our important non-state actors. Currently, Namibia is a core group member of the sponsors on the right to adequate housing and on freedom of opinion and expression and will continue to constructively participate on resolutions and other initiatives that align with our human rights obligations and priorities. Mr. President, the Universal Periodic Review remains a priority for Namibia. We consider the mechanism a unique platform for constructive dialogue between states. In May 2021, Namibia underwent its third cycle review. We accepted over 80% of the recommendations received, which reaffirms the commitment of the Namibian government to improve the human rights of all persons within its territory. Where we have lapses, we intend to accelerate improvement. This includes, and with assistance of the OHCHR, the development of a national recommendations tracking database. The right to life and human dignity are twin rights of global significance. Their promotion and protection guards our human existence. This is the reason for Namibia's consistent appeal during our participation in the UPR working group sessions that states reconsider the imposition of the death penalty. In particular, we recognize the strides made in some countries to reduce the number of executions and to place moratoriums on the imposition of the death penalty where applicable. Mr. President, Namibia recognizes the important role special procedure mechanisms of the Council plays in the protective mandate. It contributes to enhance human rights protection and promotion and provides important information that guides states' interventions. We have therefore, during the third cycle review, accepted the recommendation to consider issuing a standing invitation to all special procedures and mandate holders. To date, Namibia has had 4 visits from special procedures and mandate holders. A scheduled visit from the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The rescheduling of this visit is in the pipeline. Mr. President, as states, our collective aim is to promote and protect the human rights of all people, irrespective of origin, ethnicity, or race. Namibia's metaphoric reference to the Namibian house is intended to buttress that no one should be left out. It is therefore appalling and unacceptable that people continue to suffer racial and systemic discrimination around the world in the era of a global human rights culture. Namibia therefore remains committed to the full implementation of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, which embodies the firm commitments made by the states to rid the world of the scourges of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerances at the national, regional, and international level. We must jealously guard against attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the DTPA as one of the main instruments to combat the pandemic of racism around the world. Mr. President, as a country that played a pivotal role in shaping the women, peace and security agenda at the United Nations, Namibia has adopted the National Action Plan in this regard and established the International Women's Peace Center in our capital, Windhoek. It is this firm view that we, as part of a core group of states here at the Human Rights Council in 2020, recognize that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is essentially about redefining the role of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations and increasing efforts to protect them. Noting the progress made thus far, more can and must be done to enhance the participation of women, girls, and the youth in political decision-making processes and peace-building efforts. The representation of women within the high-level structures of the United Nations would provide good impetus for countries to follow suit, as it will sample the importance of our collective duty to ensure full universal participation and gender equality. Challenges of gender-based violence and sexual violence continue to seriously impact the implementation of policy, legal and social mechanisms to advance the human rights of women and girls. Namibia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to support all efforts aimed at the elimination of all forms of gender-based and sexual violence, ensuring women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. Mr. President, climate change, environmental degradation, and pollution remains among some of the most pressing challenges the world is confronted with today. They pose a serious threat to our and future generations, and this impacts on all of us, and Namibia is no exception. We are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In recent years, we have consistently experienced floods, droughts, veld fires, and increased human-wildlife conflict. These have had adverse effects on our communities, the economy, infrastructure, and the environment, which invariably affects our development priorities in the country. Namibia is therefore committed to Goal 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the implementation of climate change mitigation mechanisms, to fast-track the recommendations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Namibia set up the Environment Investment Fund to oversee the mobilization and usage of climate action financing intended for green projects in the country. Namibia is also extremely pleased with action of this Human Rights Council at its 48th session, which established the first ever special rapporteur on climate change and human rights, and recognized that access to a healthy environment is an important human right. In Namibia, access to a healthy environment is a constitutional imperative. The state has a very clear role to play for, among others, the maintenance of a healthy ecosystems and to sustainably develop the natural resources of Namibia for the benefit of present and future generations. Additionally, Namibia has made significant progress in incubating renewable energy assets in the form of green hydrogen and ammonia as part of its energy transition through green industrialization. Mr. President, the devastating impact of corruption on human rights is undeniable. The fulfillment of human rights obligations and meeting the aspirations of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will contribute greatly to fight against corruption. With a goal to protect public resources aimed at improving lives and livelihoods, Namibia is making steady strides towards curbing corruption in public offices. Namibia remains deeply concerned about the negative impacts of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of all human rights. We therefore once again call on sanctioning countries to remove the illegal sanctions imposed on Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. There is simply no justification to maintain these sanctions, as it inhibits the ability of sanctioned states to effectively promote and protect human rights, especially in the face of a pandemic where livelihoods have been disrupted and the right to life itself is at stake. Mr. President, the responsibilities of businesses to respect human rights have increasingly come under scrutiny over the past few years, as their desire to maximize profits often overlook human rights considerations. Therefore, the work of the Intergovernmental Working Group mandated to develop a legal binding instrument on transnational corporations and other business enterprises is critical, and we should all throw our weight behind it. Namibia, as per our state practice, will keep on with its constructive engagement in this process. We will also continue to support all initiatives aimed at making the right to development a reality. Mr. President, His Excellency Dr. Hage Geingob often remarks that Namibia is a child of international solidarity, midwifed by the United Nations. As a country that knows too well what it is to be denied the right to self-determination, we continue to advocate for the realization of this right for all peoples who still live under illegal occupation. In this light, Namibia remains committed to the cause of the people of Palestine and that of the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara. As a living testament of what international solidarity can do for a people, we call on the international community to work to realize the right to self-determination for the people of Palestine and the people of Western Sahara. We further call on all states to denounce and refrain from supporting apartheid by Israel against the Palestinian people. We echo the call that the International Criminal Court's investigations into the alleged international crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory must include apartheid as a crime against humanity. In closing, Mr. President and distinguished dignitaries, allow me to emphatically underscore Namibia's commitment to the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights. True to our pledges when we joined the Human Rights Council in 2020, Namibia will continue to make positive contributions to the debates of this August House during and outside of the ordinary sessions. I wish you effective deliberations and fruitful engagements during this session. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
I now would like to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Abdul Latif bin Rashid Al Zayani, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bahrain. You have the floor, sir.
In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, Your Excellency Federico Villegas, President of the Human Rights Council, Your Excellency Michelle Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, may the peace and mercy and blessings of Allah be upon you. I'm pleased to extend you, sir, our sincere congratulations on your election as President of the Council, wishing you and the members of the Council every success in your work. And at the outset, I would like to commend the efforts of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Michelle Bachelet. Mr. President, wars and conflicts have been ongoing in the Middle East for over a decade, leaving millions dead, injured, refugees or displaced. They deprived millions of young people from education, healthcare, shelter, peace and security. This made peace one of the most important solidarity rights to build a world of tolerance, equality and hope for a better life and environment, free from armed conflicts, terrorism and fanaticism. From this standpoint, the Kingdom of Bahrain is working to support the efforts aimed at supporting peace in the region and the world, and to maintain international peace and security, to develop relations amongst nations, and to achieve international cooperation, guided in this by the Charter of the United Nations and relevant international and regional covenants. This is based on the wise approach of His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa to consolidate noble human values and principles such as tolerance, peaceful coexistence, brotherhood and cooperation among peoples of the world, as well as through establishing mechanisms to achieve these honorable goals. Examples are the establishment of the King Hamad Global Center for Peaceful Coexistence, the establishment of Sheikh Isa Award for Service to Humanity, the issuance of the Declaration of Kingdom of Bahrain, and the establishment of King Hamad Chair for Interfaith Dialogue and Peaceful Coexistence at the Sapienza University in Italy. The Kingdom is proud of its continuous efforts to protect and promote human rights, based on the principles stipulated in the National Action Charter, the Kingdom's Constitution, and the applicable legislation, and its commitment to international treaties and conventions related to human rights. This in order to build a society in which the principles of the state of justice, law and institutions prevail, as well as to work towards strengthening the system of human rights and the advancement of the Kingdom's human rights record. Mr. President, the exceptional global circumstances that arose from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as its negative effects, have presented countries of the world with difficult channels to uphold the necessary measures to ensure the protection of humans and the preservation of their health and safety. Within the framework of the directives of His Majesty the King, the government of the Kingdom of Bahrain, and under the leadership of His Royal Highness Prince Salman bin Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister, we have taken measures to address this pandemic in a planned and effective manner. We have placed at the forefront of our priorities the preservation of human rights to health and safety, including citizens and residents alike. The shelters, testing, treatment and free vaccinations that were necessary for citizens and residents were provided without discrimination. Mr. President, the government has continued its efforts in developing the legislative system relating to the enhancing the protection of human rights, with a law on alternative sentences and measures being issued in 2017 and amended in 2021. It is a pioneering step in the field of reforming and rehabilitating those convicted of offences, returning them to their social environment and their normal life. The number of people who have benefited from the application of this law has reached 3,826. 60% of whom have completed the alternative sentence decreed by the judiciary. And this is a significant indicator of the success of this humanitarian program. The Kingdom has also continued in its great progress in the field of combating the trafficking in persons, and was designated for the 4th consecutive year within Tier 1 in the annual report of the U.S. State Department on Trafficking Persons, which is the highest annual international classification in this regard, making the Kingdom unique in this achievement amongst countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. Mr. President, efforts to support the advancement of women have witnessed a qualitative step that began 2 decades ago with the establishment of the Supreme Council for Women, and this developed national policies and qualitative plans to enhance women's rights, especially the National Plan for the Advancement of Bahraini Women, approved by His Majesty the King, and which incorporation video has been stopped. Interpreter cannot hear the speaker.
Okay. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to the head of the Cypriot delegation, His Excellency Mr. Ioannis Kasoulides, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cyprus. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege to address the 49th high-level segment of the Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, the continuously unfolding events of the last days render my physical presence impossible. The Human Rights Council is the epicenter of international dialogue and cooperation on all issues pertaining to the protection of human rights, their universality and indivisibility. The work of this Council, therefore, is about getting the standards and pushing the boundaries in order to bring out the best in humanity and to help unleash the full potential for good in our societies to ensure that the future will be brighter than the past. Yes, what we are witnessing in the last week is the unfold suffering and misery brought by war. The Republic of Cyprus unequivocally condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a flagrant violation of international law and the rules-based international order. The protection of the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of all states constitutes a fundamental principle for Cyprus. Allow me to echo the call of so many before me to the Russian Federation to immediately end hostilities and return to the path of diplomacy. Cyprus stands in solidarity with Ukraine and its people. It is important to hold an urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Ukraine during the current session. Dialogue is the only way to bridge differences and diminish the plague of polarization and war that unfortunately has beleaguered our work and our world. Strengthening rules-based multilateralism is the only way to effectively address global issues. Cyprus has been living as a victim of foreign aggression, occupation, almost for the last 50 years. The consequences and human rights violations on behalf of Turkey since 1974 are still much felt today. The fate of half of Cyprus's missing persons has yet to be determined. Those forcefully displaced by the Turkish army are not allowed to return to their homes and properties. The demographic structure in violation of the Geneva Conventions continues to be re-engineered through illegal colonization by settlers. threats to settle the ghost town of Varosha, and in breach of relevant Security Council resolutions and the 1987 resolution of the Commission of Human Rights that expressly condemns any attempts to settle any part of Varosha by people other than its inhabitants as illegal and calls for the immediate cessation of such activities. Mr. President, COVID-19 has shone a light on a wide array of deep structural inequalities and has inevitably had socioeconomic consequences, both between countries as well as internally within societies. Its impact on social, economic, and cultural rights has been immeasurable, as it has on civil and political rights. Allow me to seize this occasion to express our concerns regarding these negative trends and point out that Cyprus will continue to raise its voice with regard to the need for protecting the most exposed and most vulnerable groups within society, including women, members of the LGBTI community, children, and persons with disabilities. Conflicts, crises, and instability put the fundamentals of human rights under threat. Cyprus, in seeking to become a member of this Council for the first time between 2025 and 2027, wishes to see these issues placed high on our common agenda. Mr. President, Cyprus lies just 60 miles off the coast of Syria, which for over a decade of conflict has been beleaguered by continuous human rights violations and abuses to international humanitarian law that no amount of humanitarian assistance can redress. The effects of foreign occupation, multiple and competing power centers, massive displacement, radicalization, migration, and social and demographic engineering practices augment the fragmentation as civilians on the ground continue to suffer. As regards Libya, it is imperative that a new date of the postponed elections is announced, as the growing uncertainty could spiral into violence. Meanwhile, the presence of foreign armies and militias must be addressed without delay. Improving the human rights situation in Libya remains an important topic for the Human Rights Council, and the fact-finding mission's work towards the end is indispensable. The recognition in September of the right to a healthy environment is a timely achievement. The creation of a special rapporteur on climate change was crucial, as it is imperative to have a human rights-based approach to mitigating the effects of climate change and raise international awareness. Migration will remain a challenge in the years to come. We must all remind ourselves of our obligations regarding international protection and respect of the principle of non-refoulement. We are extremely concerned about the exploitation and abuse of migratory flows by human traffickers, as well as the political instrumentalization of migration by certain states. We call for this abuse to be stopped, and the only way to do this is for states and stakeholders across the multilateral arena to work together. Before concluding, I wish to highlight that during this session of the Human Rights Council, Cyprus, together with a cross-regional core group comprising also Argentina, Ethiopia, Greece, Iraq, Ireland, Italy, Mali, Poland, and Switzerland, will be presenting the triennial initiative on cultural rights and the protection of cultural heritage. We look forward to engaging in good faith with each and every one of the UN member states during the informal consultations and aspire to receive broad support for this resolution during the current session, as well as was always the case in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, Cyprus will continue its active engagement in the Council in order to strengthen the promotion and protection of human rights across the world. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. You have the floor, Excellency.
Ladies and gentlemen, I had hoped that after a 2-year gap I would be able to participate in the work of the United Nations Human Rights Council in person. However, I'm compelled to address you by video. The reason for this is the outrageous measures by the European Union to refuse to respect one of the fundamental human rights, the right to freedom of movement. Members of the European Union have chosen a unilateral path of illegitimate sanctions, using them to evade a direct, honest, face-to-face dialogue which they clearly apprehend. The situation in the world is not getting any easier, it is deteriorating. The main reason for this is that the US and its allies continue to aggressively impose the
across Ukraine. The High Commissioner said yesterday that Russia's attacks had killed at least 100 civilians, including children, and wounded hundreds more, and said she expects the real figures are much higher. And the casualties keep mounting, including the many civilians killed and wounded in Russia's monstrous rocket strikes that hit an apartment complex in Kharkiv yesterday. Russia's violence has driven over 500,000 Ukrainians from the country in just a few days. Children, the elderly, people with disabilities, who are making harrowing journeys through conflict zones. If President Putin succeeds in his stated goal of toppling Ukraine's democratically elected government, the human rights and humanitarian crises will only get worse. Look at Crimea, where Russia's occupation has come with extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, the brutal repression of dissent. The Kremlin is also ramping up its repression within Russia, where, even before the invasion, it was shuttering human rights organizations and harassing, poisoning, and imprisoning anti-corruption activists and political opponents. Authorities reportedly have detained thousands of Russians peacefully protesting the invasions, as well as journalists covering the demonstrations. Russian officials issued a warning to the country's press that any reporting that refers to the assault as, quote, an attack, an invasion, or a declaration of war, end quote, in other words, that tells the truth, will result in media outlets being blocked and fined. And Russia's prosecutor's office said that any Russian who assists a foreign country, foreign organization, or international organization during its so-called operation may be imprisoned for up to 20 years. These are the human rights abuses this council was created to stop. If we cannot come together now, when will we come together? We must send a resolute and unified message that President Putin should unconditionally stop this unprovoked attack, as the Secretary General and the High Commissioner have done, and immediately withdraw Russian forces from Ukraine. We must condemn, firmly and unequivocally, Russia's attempt to topple a democratically elected government and its gross human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. And we must take steps to hold the perpetrators accountable. This Council's decision to hold an urgent debate on the crisis in Ukraine is an important step toward ensuring documentation and accountability. I thank the many members who supported it. We must underscore Russia's obligation, even in its unlawful invasion, to respect international humanitarian law, including as it relates to the protection of civilians in the conflict. Council members should stop using language implying that all sides bear equal responsibility for the unprovoked attack of one side. This isn't even-handed. It's wrong and fails to place accountability where it belongs. The same goes for members who argue falsely that denouncing human rights abuses is politicizing the situation. It is failing to speak up about human rights abuses that politicizes the situation. We must reject Russia's attempts to falsely justify this attack as a defense of human rights, misappropriating terms that we reserve for the worst atrocities and disrespecting every victim of those crimes. Finally, we must press the Kremlin to respect the human rights of all Russians, including the right of citizens to peacefully express dissent and journalists to report the news, and provide information to the families of Russian soldiers who deserve to know the fate of loved ones killed in President Putin's war of choice. One can reasonably ask whether a UN member state that tries to take over another UN member state while committing horrific human rights abuses and causing massive humanitarian suffering should be allowed to remain on this council. Even as we focus on the crisis in Ukraine, it's far from the only part of the world where the council's attention is needed. In Belarus, the Lukashenko regime is brutally repressing civil society and the country's pro-democracy movement, using transnational repression to silence critics abroad and enabling Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In recent days, Belarusian authorities have detained hundreds of people demonstrating peacefully against Russia's attack. In China, the government continues to commit genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other minority groups. We urge the High Commissioner to release without delay her report on the situation there. We must redouble our efforts to address the growing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and press the Taliban to respect the rights of all Afghans, including by stopping the unjust detentions of women protesters and journalists, ending reprisals, allowing all Afghans to be educated and to work in every sector. The human rights crises in Burma, Cuba, the DPRK, Iran, Nicaragua, South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen, among others, also demand this Council's ongoing attention. In each of these places, we must not only denounce abuses, but work to stop them and hold perpetrators accountable. Yet, at a moment when the world needs both moral clarity and unity from this Council, some governments are arguing that sovereignty gives countries the right to do whatever they want within their borders. It's no coincidence that many of the governments making this argument are systematically abusing human rights and have been eerily silent in the face of Russia's flagrant assault on Ukraine's sovereignty. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights begins with the word universal, because nations decided that there are certain rights that every person, everywhere, is entitled to enjoy. Members of this Council have a special responsibility to strengthen, not weaken, those rights. One way to do that is by welcoming scrutiny of our own records. In September, the United States issued a formal, standing invitation to all UN experts who report and advise on thematic human rights issues. We urge every Council member to take this step. We know we have work to do to advance human rights at home. Every member does. What matters is that we all hold ourselves to the same standards and work to address our shortcomings, as we are doing. Here's what else you can expect from the United States on this Council. First, we're committed to working with other countries, including those we don't always agree with, to advance human rights as members have seen in their engagements with our permanent representative to the UN in Geneva, Ambassador Sheba Crocker, and our new ambassador to the Human Rights Council, Michelle Taylor. Second, we've heard repeatedly that the United States has often focused more on strengthening civil and political rights than we have on strengthening economic, social, and cultural rights. People around the world are looking to us to do both, and we hear that call. Third, we'll continue to counter anti-Israel bias and the unfair and disproportionate focus on Israel on the Council. The Commission of Inquiry and Standing Agenda Item 7 are a stain on the Council's credibility. We strongly reject them. Fourth, we'll keep fighting for the human rights of LGBTQI+ people, people with disabilities, members of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, women and girls, and all marginalized populations and people in vulnerable situations. In recent days, people on every continent have come out to demonstrate against Russia's invasion and for the rights of Ukrainians. They understand that if we allow the rules of the international order to be flagrantly trampled anywhere, we weaken them everywhere. As an Estonian student protester put it, if Ukraine is not a country, then President Putin can say Estonia is not a country either. We stand for these rules not in opposition to any government, but rather because we see our shared interest in striving for a world where all people of all nations enjoy human rights and peace and security. And because history has shown us the darkness and suffering that comes when these rules are abandoned. People in Ukraine and around the world are looking to us to stand up and stand together. We must not let them down.
Thank you, Excellency. Now I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wopke Hoekstra, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Please, Excellency, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, for decades, we, the international community, have worked to strengthen the rules-based order in the strong conviction that we don't want to live in a world where might is right. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is threatening not only the lives of many innocent Ukrainians, but also the international rules-based order. The single most important structure that we have to protect our people. And that makes this 49th Council meeting of the utmost importance. We know that the worst human rights violations happen during armed conflict. We know that we must do everything we can to protect what we've built over the last 75 years. And we know that here in this Council, we have the power to turn our collective anger into a collective response. To protect the lives and rights of innocent people, and to protect the legal frameworks aimed at securing peace, justice, and human rights. The Netherlands strongly condemns Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. It is a clear and gross violation of international law, a breach of the United Nations Charter, and it will not and cannot go unanswered. The Netherlands also strongly condemns the violence against innocent civilians. In the horrendous bombardment of Kharkiv, dozens of innocent lives were reportedly lost and many more injured. cluster ammunition was used against civilians in residential areas. Such indiscriminate attacks are war crimes. And those directly responsible for these acts of war must be held accountable. By establishing the International Criminal Court, we gave legal expression to the moral imperative that the most serious crimes must not go unpunished. ICC Prosecutor Khan has already pointed out that the ICC may investigate any act of genocide, any crime against humanity, and any war crime committed in Ukraine since 20 February 2014. And yesterday evening he announced the opening of an investigation into the situation in Ukraine. And we call on the ICC prosecutor to pursue this as a matter of urgency. As we've seen here in the Human Rights Council many times before, with Syria, Myanmar, Yemen, the road to justice begins with the truth. Truth that can be found only through independent fact-finding and evidence gathering. And for this reason, the Netherlands fully supports the establishment of a UN Commission of Inquiry. A commission that can ensure independent and impartial monitoring and reporting, that can collect and analyze evidence so that perpetrators can be identified and held accountable for their actions. In order to support the collection of evidence, we will donate €1 million to support the creation of a civil society accountability mechanism. And this investigative mechanism would collect and analyze information and evidence of crimes committed in Ukraine to assist criminal proceedings in the future. And this allows us to prepare for the moment when criminal proceedings can start before a national or international court. For the moment when justice will be served. Stop this mad war. That's what courageous protesters are shouting at rallies throughout Russia. Thousands of them have been arrested. There is no excuse for war. That is what the courageous Russian diplomatic correspondent Elena Chernenko wrote in an open letter. And she has been expelled from the diplomatic press pool. No to war. Those are the words used by the courageous Russian television host Ivan Urgant. His show has not been aired since. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be crystal clear. With just a fraction of the courage of these people, we, the members of the Human Rights Council, can help protect the human rights that are at risk and are being violated today. Those of Ukrainians who have the right to live in peace, freedom and safety, who have the right to democracy, who have the right to be informed through free and independent media. The same rights we all have. Yet the reality is that Ukrainian civilians are being killed right now. That democracy is under threat, and that Russian cyber attacks and disinformation have been going on for years. Similarly, Russian protesters have the right to gather peacefully. Russian news reporters have the right to report freely. And Russian citizens have the right to know the facts and be informed. Yet the reality is that their rights too are being severely violated, and we cannot condone these violations. Ladies and gentlemen, if we do not act and show courage now, we are undermining the significance of this very Council, undermining the rules-based international legal order we shaped together. Because the attack on Ukraine is also an attack on the United Nations Charter, an attack from within, by a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a member of this council. The UN was established out of a conviction that we need to solve problems together. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted out of a strong belief that we must protect the values we all share and stand for. And today, that is exactly what we must do. The Netherlands calls upon the members of this Council to stand united, to ensure that the road to justice starts here. Membership of this Council is not a free ride. It comes with responsibilities to all of us. And one of them, ladies and gentlemen, is to ensure that justice and accountability are not empty words. They must lead to actions, and we owe that to the victims. Therefore, the Netherlands will also support the UN Human Rights Office with an additional €1 million so that it can strengthen its field presence in Ukraine. We call on all members of the Human Rights Council, we call on all of you to support all efforts to end this conflict and to achieve justice and accountability for all the crimes committed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Now I have the floor. I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Saifuddin Abdullah, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Malaysia, for a video message. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner for Human Rights, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, allow me to congratulate Ambassador Federico Villegas on his election as the President of the HRC, as well as members of the Bureau to steer this august body. I wish to thank the international community for their support of Malaysia's HRC membership for the 2022-2024 term. I reaffirm Malaysia's commitment to deliver on our pledges and foster constructive engagement, inclusivity, understanding, and mutual respect at our discourse at the Council based on the principle of peaceful coexistence. Malaysia will strive to become a mediator for peace, a facilitator for collaboration, and a builder of consensus. As we enter the third year of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are still far from overcoming the deadly virus, with new variants spreading faster and wider than the rate of the global vaccine distribution. It is in these uncertain times that we have to unite for humanity. We must work together to collectively address our shared global challenges, recover better, and build back stronger. We must work hand in hand and intensify our efforts to ensure vaccine equity and that no one is left behind. In this spirit, Malaysia has contributed almost 900,000 doses of vaccine and 23 million units of equipment, including face masks and medical gloves, to countries in need. Mental health has also emerged as a silent parallel pandemic, evidenced by the rising case of depression, anxiety, and suicide worldwide. In October 2021, Malaysia launched the National Strategic Plan for Mental Health, which emphasizes intersectoral collaboration and crisis preparedness to ensure early intervention for mental health issues. Malaysia also plans to further highlight the issue of mental health and human rights in the context of the public service in upcoming council sessions. We hope to raise greater awareness on the mental health situation among public servants during the pandemic, and we welcome the collaboration of interested parties. In recent development, last October, Malaysia co-sponsored a groundbreaking HRC resolution recognizing that enjoying a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. we are committed to conserving planetary health as we aspire to achieve a net zero greenhouse gas emission target by 2050. At the national level, we established the Climate Change Action Council to discuss and set the policy direction to this end. I now would like to draw attention to the escalating situation in Ukraine that threatens to evolve into another humanitarian and human rights quagmire. Malaysia strongly urges all concerned parties to urgently take steps to de-escalate and prevent further loss of lives and devastation. Malaysia had experienced firsthand the brutality of the conflict in Ukraine with the downing of Flight MH17 in 2014, resulting in the tragic loss of innocent life. We do not wish to see further victims caught in the unfortunate conflicts, especially civilians and the vulnerable groups. We call on all parties to respect the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as international humanitarian and human rights laws. All efforts must be vigorously pursued and accelerated to seek a peaceful and amicable solution to the conflict based on international law and the UN Charter. Malaysia will also continue to highlight long-standing humanitarian and human rights challenges, particularly the plight of the Palestinian people and the Rohingya refugees. Decades of Israel's gross human rights abuses and apartheid practices must stop, and the international community must uphold the Palestinians' right to self-determination. Malaysia is also disappointed that the predicament of the Rohingya refugees has not improved. Finding a long-term solution requires addressing the root causes and guaranteeing accountability, which could enable their safe, voluntary and dignified return to Rakhine. As an ASEAN member state, Malaysia will continue to work with all stakeholders towards the implementation of the 5-point consensus and ultimately an amicable and sustainable solution for Myanmar's return to the path of democracy. We believe that the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy and the ASEAN Chair's Special Envoy on Myanmar can play a pivotal role in ensuring inclusive engagement and bringing all stakeholders to the table. Malaysia stands ready to play a constructive role towards this end. Thank you.
I thank you, Excellency. Now it's honor for me to invite Her Excellency Ms. Najla Mohammad, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Government of National Unity of Libya. Excellency, the floor is yours.
سعادة السيد فيدريكو فيغاس رئيس مجلس حقوق
Your Excellency, Mr. Federico Villegas, President of the Human Rights Council, Your Excellency, Madam Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, please allow me to take this opportunity to congratulate Mr. Federico Villegas upon his assumption of the presidency of the Human Rights Council, as well as the members of the Bureau. I wish them every success in the work of this council. Respect for human rights is no longer a domestic issue concerning just governments and states alone. It is an issue that affects all of us across the international community. We are all obliged to work collectively, together, to promote human rights across the planet. The COVID-19 pandemic tested international solidarity and our ability to work together to protect and promote human rights and basic rights, the right to life, the right to free circulation, and so forth. This pandemic also, in this way, highlighted that international organizations and their member states need to coordinate better in order to cooperatively promote human rights. The world today is at a crossroads. Indeed, the very principles of human rights, which were very present in the minds of the authors of the Charter of the United Nations, remain topical and relevant. Those rights remain indivisible at a time when we see new unknown dangers in the terms of the pandemic, conflicts, and indeed war. The attack against Ukrainian sovereignty acutely and painfully reminds us of how important it is to protect and preserve those rights, and how important it is to prohibit all forms of force in resolving conflicts. It is vital for the international community to return to the international human rights mechanisms. My country has seen the consequences of war, the war which was waged by proxy, and we have paid a high price for that. Through national dialogue, however, we were able to rebuild. We are mindful that we are still in a sensitive period of our history. We are striving to rebuild our state and institutions after years of political division and armed conflict. Libya now sees a thin ray of hope with the end of the National Libyan Dialogue and the Geneva Accords of last year. That agreement helped us create a government of national unity, which heralded in a period of peace in our country. We have not forgotten. On the contrary, we have organized elections, parliamentary elections and presidential ones, slated for next December. We have seen, and this despite the challenges that we've seen, logistic and otherwise. Democratic participation is the central pillar of the construction of the rule of law and state participation in the state. The government of national unity, with a large slew of political figures and political parties, is working to guarantee a climate favorable for the organization of elections as soon as possible. The government of national unity is working to implement and execute its responsibilities to promote human rights far from any kind of discrimination. We have launched various initiatives to overhaul the status of detainees, notably those in prisons. We have worked for migrants to find their way home to their native towns and regions. We have punished hate speech, this in the parliament and across the government. Indeed, we have understood that it's important to refer to the justice system all violators of human rights and to undertake investigations. This is why I've accelerated investigations to identify perpetrators and refer them to the courts. Our government has worked with our mission in Geneva to expedite the international inquiry which was initiated within this council. As regards economic and social rights, our government has raised the standard of living of the population, implementing a number of measures to boost the basic wage, notably for the most underprivileged. We have built rebuilding funds to fund reconstruction in the most heavily affected towns. We have worked with international partners to deliver the sufficient number of vaccine doses to fight COVID-19, and we have launched a campaign to encourage people to get vaccinated. Migration is a global challenge that we have seen in our country historically on a number of occasions. My country, through its geographic location, is a natural transit corridor for migration for both the south and north. This creates an additional burden for our country, which already encounters and struggles with instability. Many migrants have become victims of human trafficking and transnational organized crime groups. Numerous migrants have been victims of various violations of their rights, and we are striving to bring accountability and stop these crimes. However, we cannot handle these issues of human trafficking and organized crime alone. We need a global, collective effort that must be articulated globally to handle the issues of criminal networks and human trafficking in the area of migration. Guaranteeing human rights, consolidating and protecting them are part of the humanitarian and global efforts which require joint, shared efforts by the international community. This is how we must strengthen and consolidate the bodies protecting human rights. My country is dedicated to these principles and values during the current period of transition towards democracy. It is in this way that we hope, through our place in this body, to continue to promote human rights. We have worked in full transparency with the Commission of Inquiry of this Council, which was sent to Libya. We have also striven to provide additional information for the report in cooperation with the Commission of Inquiry delegates. We look forward to cooperating fruitfully with the international community in order to achieve peace, security and development, not just in Libya, but across our region and indeed the planet. It is vital that we focus on the root causes of the crises and wars, terrorism, climate change. We are fully committed to achieve implementation of the 2030 goals and the African goals for 2060. All of these objectives and goals are ambitions which we support. Together, we can do this. We can condemn the violations of the rights of the Palestinian people as well as aggressions against the peoples in the Arab world. We wish you every success. Thank you.
Now I have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Carolina Valdiva, Acting Minister for Foreign Affairs of Chile, for video message, please.
Señor President, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, I am addressing you, representing Chile, during this high-level segment of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. Chile condemns the armed aggression of Russia and the violation on sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, and reiterates its appeal for dialogue to find a peaceful solution to the conflict as set out in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Both Russia as well as Ukraine are members of the Human Rights Council, and as such, we believe and understand that they have committed themselves to respecting the highest standards of protecting human rights. We would appeal to Russia to withdraw its troops, respect territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine, and avoid the loss of innocent lives and material damage by respecting the Geneva Conventions. I wish to express the Chilean people's solidarity to the millions of people affected in Ukraine by this war. Chile harbors the hope that dialogue and negotiations will prevail to prevent a greater escalation of this conflict threatening international peace and security. President, for Chile, the Human Rights Council is the key area in terms of cooperation, dialogue and consensus in the field of human rights within the United Nations. We defend the need for a multilateral order that recognizes the profound interrelationship between the dimensions of peace and security, democracy and participation, sustainable development and inclusion, and human rights. To begin, we would like to take this opportunity to support the work carried out by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Michelle Bachelet, whose independent voice, together with the very many actions undertaken under her direction, are extremely relevant to highlight respect for human rights in the complex circumstances of the present time. President, Excellencies, Chile advocates strengthening multilateral mechanisms for promoting and protecting human rights, both universal as well as regional. And by bearing in mind such purposes, we would like to restate that the Chilean government has presented its candidacy to the United Nations Human Rights Council for the period 2023-2025. the election of which will take place in New York during the 77th session of the General Assembly in November 2022. This candidacy will allow our country to reassert its commitment to promoting and protecting human rights as the backbone of the state of Chile and its public policies. Promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are fundamental pillars of Chile's foreign policy. That is why Chile is party to the key international human rights treaties and instruments that protect civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as women's rights, children's rights, those of indigenous people, minorities, and other vulnerable groups. President, distinguished representatives, our candidacy is occurring at a challenging time for the Council's work, given the need to revitalise multilateralism and recognise new realities in terms of human rights, particularly in the sphere of civil and political rights and in terms of gender and women's rights. The gender agenda for our country is a priority in the Human Rights Council. That is why Chile is a coordinator, together with Canada, of the two panels which take place in the annual debate on women's rights during the June sessions in the Human Rights Council. We address this topic from various standpoints, including gender equity, violence against women, sexual and reproductive rights, women's participation in the public sphere, amongst other areas. I'd like to inform you that my country, after 20 years, finally ratified the optional protocol to CEDAW. It deposited it before the United Nations Secretary-General on the 12th of March, 2020. President, distinguished representatives, Chile very much values universality, equal treatment, dialogue, and cooperation stemming from the Universal Periodic Review mechanism in the terms set out in Resolution 60/251. Our country participates in the periodic reviews of all states, and we view it as a unique peer review tool to promote universality, interdependence, indivisibility, and interrelationship of all human rights. The priorities set out by Chile when it issues recommendations to states are the ratification of international human rights instruments, institutional strengthening of human rights, combating discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation, identity and gender expression, as well as sexual characteristics, also the prevention and protection against torture, abolition or moratorium in the use of the death penalty. Furthermore, Chile believes that the special procedures are a key mechanism in promoting and protecting human rights, and a vital contribution to their gradual development. Since 2009, Chile has held an open-ended standing invitation and fully cooperates with the special procedures, and it is a part of the group of friends of those procedures. President, distinguished representatives, the major challenges mankind faces, such as climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and inequality, are all issues that must be tackled with a human rights-based approach. In that connection, Chile supports the establishment of an internationally binding instrument which would make it possible to better tackle future health emergencies with greater solidarity and cooperation. Sir, distinguished representatives, building a democratic and respectful society where human rights are respected is ongoing work, and it is the tireless commitment of Chile's state since it returned to democracy in 1990. Our country is committed to continue undertaking its institutional efforts to attain truth, justice, and full reparation of all human rights violations which took place during the 1973 to 1989 dictatorship. Furthermore, in 2019, Chile experienced a number of social mobilization movements which compelled the government to declare states of constitutional emergency and to make greater efforts in maintaining public order and security. As part of that crisis, our country extended an invitation to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and to other organizations to visit Chile. And it is committed to strengthening investigations because of the events that took place during the social movements, and to adopt all legal and political measures to guarantee that they do not reoccur. President, distinguished representatives, by way of conclusion, we would wish to restate Chile's commitment to continue working so that every day it is an active member of the international community, which is called upon to carry out the noble task of constantly improving the human rights scene in all corners of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Maintenant, j'ai l'honneur.
I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Madame Aline Antonella Ndembet Damas, Justice Minister of Gabon. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
President of the Human Rights Council, Your Excellency Secretary General, High Commissioner, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is for me an honor and a pleasure once again to take the floor before this august assembly on the occasion of this high-level segment of the current session of the Human Rights Council, the 49th session, after 2 years of absence due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we come back together. This is encouraging because we see now a new ray of hope that we can return to normal life in our respective cities. And this, thanks to the work of our states, Gabon has spared no effort, indeed, to fight this pandemic, taking preventive, courageous measures, the appropriate measures, and adopting a national vaccination program, the efficacy of which has made it possible to revert the circulation and growth of the virus. Through me, I would like to extend to you the warm greetings of the head of state, Ali Ngom, and the head of the state and the government of Gabon. I would like to warmly congratulate Mr. Federico Villegas, His Excellency and Ambassador of Argentina, and to congratulate him upon his assumption to the presidency of the Human Rights Council for 2022. Finally, I would like to express a deep appreciation to Her Excellency Madame Michelle Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for her tireless leadership and her guidance through these difficult 2 years. President, Excellencies, taking the floor during this high-level segment, at the outset, I would like to reiterate most solemnly the commitment of my country to human rights and basic freedoms as they flow from the key international mechanisms and treaties to which we are a party. This commitment is translated into our shared actions, measures taken internationally and nationally to promote and consolidate protections for human rights. On the international level, my country is happy to have presented our latest periodic review before the Committee for the Eradication of Discrimination Against Women on the 8th and 9th of February 2022 during the last session. In addition, we have submitted our first periodic report under the Convention Against Forced Disappearances on the 7th of February this year. This reflects a desire and a determination by Gabon to cooperate with the human rights mechanisms. and this will continue without any doubt through the coming months with the submission of other reports, notably the report on the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, the Convention Against Torture, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the Universal Periodic Review, slated for the month of October 2022. In addition, as a part of our mandate in the Human Rights Council, Gabon is pursuing a policy of active engagement through initiatives that we have taken in a national capacity and through our support to our peers and the groups to which we belong. For example, we welcome the consensus-based adoption on the 12th of July 2021 of Resolution 47/L2 on the management of consolidation of gender-based rights under the Africa Group banner. This was a resolution which underscores the importance of optimized, effective management in protecting the rights of women and girls, bringing a new legislative dynamic and institutional framework to ensure the legalization of the equality of rights and ensuring sustainable development goals by 2030. Under this same issue, we would like to count on all states during the discussion panel, which will take place during the 50th session of the Human Rights Council next June. On the national level, and with constant technical support from the High Commissioner for Human Rights through the office in Yaoundé, numerous efforts have been executed in order to promote and guarantee human rights to benefit all of our citizens. In last November, for example, 3 workshops were held on capacity building for magistrates and the members of steering committees to help guide our work fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as strengthening our work on human rights across Central Africa. The same goes for the implementation of a vast public policy to drive down inequality between the genders and to fight violence against women, in compliance with the spirit of the Convention on the Eradication of all Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 also, the Beijing Programme of Action, and the call for action of the Secretary-General of the United Nations for Human Rights, as launched in 2020. Within the framework of this vast public set of policies, called Gabon Equality, we started with an analysis of the circumstances and situation in which women live. Over 30 measures were adopted for application starting in September 2021 on the basis of 3 key laws. The law amending various provisions of the Criminal Code, the law bringing amendments to the Civil Code, and a specific law aimed at eradicating violence against women. As regards the Criminal Code, the modifications made have made it possible to introduce new crimes such as discrimination, moral harassment in domestic life, as well as aggravating circumstances in other areas when there is violence perpetrated by members of a family, protecting the rights of women wherever there are perpetrators of violence against women and they are protected by the state or by others. This law introduces the concept, new concepts protecting the rights of women, including related to abortions. On the Civil Code, the reforms focus on births and registrations, changing from 15 to 18 the minimum age for marriage, new rights for women to engage in paid work, consensus-based divorce with a new particular procedure, punishment for violence and the exclusion, allowance of violence as a reason for divorce. As regards violence against women, a new set of provisions is provided to ensure that victims provide better, more comprehensive care. These provisions list all forms of violence, notably physical violence, psychological violence, moral violence, sexual violence, as well as economic and property-based violence, whether this is within a family or in the professional arena. Second, these provisions put in place for women victims of violence new measures, including for outreach and prevention in all areas, the right to free information, social assistance, as well as legal aid, rights associated with work, coercion, protection stipulated by judges to protect victims in danger. This new law also establishes a national ombudsman for the rights of women. In order to guarantee the effective application of these reforms, information sessions were organized across all of the national territory for all persons in the judiciary system and auxiliary services. A vast outreach program is currently underway across the population, involving all civil society stakeholders. President, ladies and gentlemen, in our tireless desire to ensure the enjoyment of human rights for the most vulnerable, the government of Gabon, upon instructions of the head of state, is currently putting in place a national policy regarding crimes and punishment for adequate solutions to be found to permanently improve the work of the judiciary and penitentiary systems. This new policy will be shored up with a new policy for rehabilitation and reintegration. It's currently being drafted, and it will make it possible to fight recidivism and to ensure that people coming out of prison can be returned into society and reintegrated. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, Gabon is starting its second year as a member of the Human Rights Council. We are therefore determined to support the Council in the development of new tools which will serve as a basis for protecting and promoting human rights, consolidating the work of the Human Rights Council to ensure respect for human rights. In a context where the challenges are now becoming ever more global, and where our destinies are all ever more interlinked, we need to demonstrate international solidarity in order to build a more prosperous, fair, and equitable world. All that remains is for me once again to thank you and reiterate the commitment and mobilization of the people of Gabon to ensure that we achieve our shared goals, including guaranteeing that universal human rights are enjoyed by all. Thank you.
Je vous remercie, Excellence.
I thank you, Your Excellency.
Give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Juan Carlos Olguin, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility of Ecuador, for visa message, please.
Distinguished heads of state, ministers, authorities, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to speak within the high-level segment of this ordinary session of the United Nations Human Rights Council. I wish to restate Ecuador's unwavering commitment to respecting, promoting and protecting human rights in line with compliance with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. My country has ratified all international human rights conventions and instruments, and openly and continuously collaborates with all the United Nations mechanisms and special procedures. The COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on the entire world, and Ecuador was no exception. Our country experienced a health, economic and social emergency. However, the national government managed available resources responsibly and did its utmost to address the crisis. As a result, in 8 months of this government, the success of the vaccination campaign is undoubtable. And today, we have good news to share with you that over 83% of the population is fully vaccinated. This is an achievement attained by the government and the Ecuadorian people. It was also made possible thanks to international cooperation, including the vaccination of the Guarani population to protect that indigenous people that lives in voluntary isolation in the heart of the Ecuadorian Amazon. I wish to recall that Ecuador, a year ago, together with Azerbaijan, on behalf of the non-aligned movement, presented a resolution called Resolution on the Guarantee of the Right to Health through Equitable and Universal Access to Vaccines in response to pandemics and other health emergencies. This resolution was adopted unanimously by the Human Rights Council and received support from a large number of countries. This is a topic which we need to continue working on, given that there are still problems when it comes to the equitable access to vaccines. Our National Development Plan 2021-2025 is based on the principles of democracy, diversity, solidarity, transparency and the fight against corruption. And it seeks, amongst other objectives, to ensure human rights, eradicate poverty, increase and boost social inclusion and attain prosperity. Ecuador has shown to be continuously concerned about increasing protection for the most vulnerable persons and groups of society. When it comes to the rights of children and adolescents, we are fostering programs to reduce poverty and do away with chronic child malnutrition. We will continue to defend the rights of indigenous peoples. We are committed to defending the rights of persons with disabilities, and Ecuador has spearheaded work and leadership in this regard globally. Ecuador is party to all international conventions to promote and protect women's rights. We encourage compliance with international instruments, making it possible to achieve gender equality, and we encourage measures to be adopted to prevent, eradicate, sanction and bring to justice the perpetrators of violence against women. On this point, for the first time in the history of the country, the budget aimed at preventing and eradicating violence against women has been quadrupled. Our country has taken very significant steps towards recognizing and respecting diversities in all its forms. We established an administrative unit within the executive, which will make it possible to draft the first comprehensive public policy to prevent and stamp out all forms of violation and discrimination based on sexual orientation and sexogeneric diversity. With respect to the rights of persons deprived of liberty, the national government aims to present or table in the coming weeks a social rehabilitation policy with a human rights-based approach. This has been prepared with support from the United Nations system and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. My country shall continue to promote the preparation and implementation of international standards in the area of businesses and human rights. In that connection, the permanent representative of Ecuador before the United Nations in Geneva will continue as the presidency of the Intergovernmental Open-Ended Working Group to draft an internationally binding instrument on transnational companies and other businesses in terms of human rights. Nationally, Ecuador will continue to prepare a national action plan on businesses and human rights under the United Nations guiding principles. Turning now to the fight against corruption, Ecuador signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. This will make it possible to establish mechanisms to achieve integrity, transparency and accountability. Ecuador will continue to take an active part in the discussion of the key areas of interest on this Council's agenda. We very much hope that the lessons that the pandemic has left behind will remain, so that they remain as fundamental objectives in our memory, and that all difficulties that we have overcome will pave the way for a new understanding amongst peoples. I thank you very much.
I thank you. Now, I have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Wendy Carolina Morales Urbina, Attorney General of Nicaragua, for video message.
Excellency Federico Villegas, President of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations Organization, representatives of member states, members and observers, distinguished representatives of international organizations, the Government of National Reconciliation of Nicaragua at this Human Rights Council would like to refer to the way in which bodies and international organizations such as this Council value the implementation of human rights amongst countries. Some countries are tolerant with the atrocities that take place. This unequal assessment leads to manipulation of human rights and other hegemonic standards as a result of economic and political policies from imperialist countries, which affect the sovereignty of countries and do not wish for any foreign intervention. The development of human rights, which this international body must promote, is the implementation of these rights within the framework of the right to identity, sovereignty, and the historical identity of each country, without losing sight of human rights set out in the mandates and policies adopted, which particularly place emphasis on dissemination of information for analysis, which should be impartial and objective. We note and disapprove of sources used by the United Nations Office as regards the current updates, reports, preliminary reports and investigations, which, far from being based on true information of societies, only collect the voices of some sectors with political economic interests defined under the policies drawn up by major neo-colonialist countries. In the case of Nicaragua, the so-called updates on human rights are not fair or equitable, but they are true aggressions against our country. This type of reports aim to discredit our authorities and national institutions, as well as the legal system underpinning the Nicaraguan state, on the basis of false and impartial, unbiased information, with the aim of interfering in our affairs and interfering in our sovereignty, and echoing the interventionist policies of the US and other European countries against our country. We will always restate that issuing value judgments is very easy to do. What's really difficult is to achieve implementation, particularly when it comes to economic, social and cultural rights that benefit the entire country. And to do this in the midst of permanent attacks is even more difficult. We are talking in all authority about the right to life, the right to health, the right to education, to work, the right to drinking water, to electric energy, to housing, to women's rights, children's rights, young persons, the elderly, combating extreme poverty, eradicating illiteracy, citizens' security, the rights of indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants, amongst other rights, whereby we have attained major progress. We categorically state that there cannot be human rights without the democratization of wealth, and this is implemented by public policies on health and the well-being of the Nicaraguan people, as set out by our government. Nicaragua has been constantly subjected to those who wish to attack directly our human rights of the Nicaraguan people. This is a real crime against humanity. However, these unfair unilateral measures, which are coercive and illegal against our people, will not discourage us or undermine us, and we will continue to be firm in the fight against and attain the highest levels of democracy. Nicaragua never has been a threat to any country in the world. We are a peaceful, decent courageous country within the international community. We claim justice and equality, and that is why we state that this forum is against the human rights of Nicaraguan people. We would ask the hostilities to come to an end against our people. We would denounce the emphasis placed which seek to justify sanctions against countries based on international human rights standards. We would appeal to this forum once again to take on its responsibility in terms of the history of mankind, respecting the peoples of the world to take their own decisions and to live in peace with sovereignty, respect and human consideration. Thank you very much.
I thank you. It's my honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Abdul Mumin, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh, for video message. Excellency, you have the floor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to address this council. Our country, Bangladesh, was born out of a long struggle against injustice, discrimination, and oppression. So when we started our journey as a free nation, we attached a strong commitment to human rights and fundamental freedom of our people. This spirit has remained unchanged ever since. Our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, envisioned a country that would uphold the principles of equality, inclusivity, democracy, and justice. Taking inspiration from his ideals, our democracy has flourished with an elected parliament, independent judiciary, free media, and vibrant civil society. These institutions have collectively worked in favor of a stronger focus on human rights and fundamental freedoms. They have also helped us in mainstreaming human rights in our national discourse. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the government of Bangladesh is relentlessly working to uphold the rule of law, good governance, and civil liberty. We have adopted a whole of society approach to ensure economic, social, and cultural rights and protect civil and political rights. Our government has remained vigilant against violent extremism, terrorism, human trafficking, and narcotic use that have the potential to jeopardize human rights enjoyment to all. With the highest level of professionalism and respect for human rights, our law enforcing agencies have been trying to fight these social evils. Equity, inclusiveness, and fairness characterize our development endeavors. We take pride in our success in gender equality and women empowerment. Today, in Bangladesh, women have greater participation in legislation, administration, judiciary, and civil society. We have also ensured social inclusion and empowerment of the third gender people. Recently, 2 third gender persons have been elected in our local government elections. Social justice is integral to our development policies and programs. We have put in place special measures for vulnerable sections of the society to enable them to enjoy the fundamental rights and participate in all spheres of national life. As we fight the COVID pandemic, we have ensured human rights remain at the center of all prevention, preparedness, containment, and treatment measures. Mr. President, our respect for human dignity led us to provide shelter to over 1 million forcibly displaced Rohingyas of Myanmar. By doing so, we saved thousands of lives. Despite enormous challenges, we continue to host these persecuted people and ensure their safety and security. Last year, in this August Council, I called for proactive global efforts to seek a durable solution to the Rohingya crisis. Today, I again urge the international community to help ensure that the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State are implemented, accountability and justice are delivered, and a conducive environment for the return of the forcibly displaced Rohingyas is created in Myanmar. The international community must not shy away from their responsibility to resolve the crisis and relieve Bangladesh from the burden that Myanmar has imposed upon us. I would like to reiterate that the Rohingya crisis was created by Myanmar and its solution also lies with them. We must not forget that it is the right of the Rohingya people to be able to return to their homeland, Myanmar. Excellencies, Bangladesh attaches high importance to the work of Human Rights Council in promotion and protection of human rights globally. We strongly support the UPR mechanism to reinforce countries' endeavors to promote and protect human rights. We also cooperate closely with other mechanisms of the Council, including the special procedures. We are equally mindful of our obligation under the treaty bodies. As a testimony to our robust engagement, we have submitted 7 treaty body reports in recent years. Mr. President, let me briefly share our perspective on some global problems that require greater attention from the Council. Climate change is an existential threat to humanity. While it is a global crisis, the most vulnerable countries bear the greatest burden. The Council has a moral responsibility of contributing to the acceleration of global climate actions to save lives and livelihoods and promote climate justice. Inequality is another threat to human development and dignity. We have witnessed its worst nature during the pandemic, particularly in the form of vaccine inequality. We would like to see that Council addresses inequality within and among the states more deftly. In many parts of the world, migrants remain vulnerable and experience discrimination. During the pandemic, migrant workers were disproportionately affected due to their unequal access to healthcare and livelihood opportunities. The Council needs to reflect on solutions that can protect the rights of the migrants more effectively, irrespective of their status. Mr. President, the Human Rights Council has completed 15 years of its existence. This pioneer human rights body was created to promote and protect human rights around the world. It is now high time to reflect if the Council has lived up to its expectations. In our view, the Universal Periodic Review is the flagship mechanism of this body, which has changed the culture of selective consideration of human rights. Surely, this universal mechanism needs continued nurturing and support. Like this, we also need to remain impartial and non-selective and avoid confrontation and the application of double standards in dealing with human rights issues in the Council. On its part, Bangladesh will continue to play a constructive role and remain engaged with all to make this truly an effective human rights organ of the United Nations. I thank you. Joy Bangla, Joy Bangabandhu.
Thank you, Excellency. Now, I have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Retno Marsudi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, for video message.
Mr. President, as we meet today, the people of Ukraine are suffering. War and conflict have resulted in innocent civilian casualties. It has created humanitarian catastrophe. The military attack on Ukraine is unacceptable. It must be put to an end. Please stop. A peaceful resolution through diplomacy must be put forward. The UN Charter and international law, including respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country, must be adhered to. The human rights situation in Ukraine warrants the Council undivided attention. The safety and well-being of the people is our utmost priority. In this connection, we call on all parties to ensure safe passage for all civilians and to allow and facilitate rapid, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine has compounded human rights challenges, particularly when most of us continue to struggle with COVID-19 and its multidimensional impact. Global unemployment has climbed over 200 million mark. Over 1 billion people could be living in extreme poverty by 2030. Discrimination and inequalities run rampant, robbing the less fortunate among us of an opportunity to have a better life. Mr. President, this should be our wake-up call. The pandemic must not divert our attention away from human rights situation around the world. Our effort to promote and protect human rights depends on our ability to address these challenges collectively and urgently. We must always avail ourselves to assist those in need. We have to stand strong for human rights and reject human wrongs. There are 3 areas that should be our focus. First, ensure everyone has an equal chance to defeat COVID-19. Health is a fundamental human right, and so is access to medical solutions. The Council must reinforce its commitment to fulfill the right to health, including through fair and equitable access to vaccine for all. As President of the G20, Indonesia stands ready to collaborate further in this effort with a view to rebuilding stronger global health architecture. Second, uphold democratic value in addressing global challenges. Colleagues, democracy, development, and human rights are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Democratic values must be at the core of our pandemic response to ensure no one is left behind, guarantee the voices of the people, and strengthen international enabling environment for sustainable recovery. The Council must reinvigorate dialogue on the future of democracy in promoting and protecting human rights. Third, advance protection of women's rights. Colleagues, women continue to be disadvantaged in many aspects of life, including access to health care, social protection, and decent employment. Violence against women continues, especially in the conflict zone. Indonesia knows full well the potential of women in being part of the solution, and we are committed to helping other countries harness such potential, including Afghanistan, where we continue to explore possible cooperation on women empowerment. And going forward, I hope to see further integration on a gender perspective in the Council works and deliberation. Mr. President, successful discharge of the Council's mandate requires us to address its shortcomings. We need an adaptive and agile Council that is well prepared to address human rights challenges of our time. We cannot allow politicization of human rights here, including the misuse of the Council for short-sighted objectives. We are here not to assign blame, but to learn from each other and advance cooperation on human rights. To continue our contribution to the Council's work, we have put forward our candidacy to the Council for 2024-2026. And I look forward to having a constructive discussion with all of you during the 4th cycle of the UPR in November. I thank you very much.
Thank you. I
now have the honour of giving the floor to His Excellency Mr. Subramaniam Akdesor, who is the Minister of Justice for Benin. President, heads of delegations, ladies and gentlemen, allow me at the outset extend a warm greeting to this august assembly on the occasion of this high-level segment, which is the first solemn gathering of the Council where my country, Benin, is taking part as a new member for the 2022-2024 period. I would like to extend the congratulations of Benin to the President, Mr. Villegas, to whom we wish every success. On behalf of my government, I would like to thank all the members of the United Nations who supported Benin's election on the 14th of October 2021 and give Benin the opportunity to reaffirm through this second mandate to the Council its commitment and determination to work for the promotion and protection of human rights, both within its borders and around the world, in these troubled times where new threats against human rights are emerging. Benin has always shown itself to be committed to universal principles and values, such as those promoted by the UN Charter, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the African Charter of People's Rights. Those provisions are part and parcel of our constitution. And this has been a constant in our countries since 1990, and it was consolidated through the ratification of major international legal human rights instruments. Benin's commitment to protect and promote human rights also led to tangible progress in recent years in the framework of the implementation of the SDGs, especially in the field of healthcare, education, the protection of vulnerable people, the improvement of living conditions for our population, and the fight against poverty. When it comes to healthcare, allow me to refer to the project for strengthening human capital, which was launched by our President in 2019, and which aims to provide substantial human resources in order to ensure that people living in rural areas benefit from health insurance, loans, and pension. This project has entered its second phase now, namely that of rollout, following a pilot project that concerned 21 of our regions. In the field of education, free primary education for all children has now been extended to secondary schools, in particular for girls, who now benefit from free education until they get their diploma of completion of first cycle of studies. We have also established a system of priority school meals, and the government, along with the United Nations, or the World Food Programme rather, has also launched a school canteen programme, and this partnership ensures that children get 2 hot meals a day at school so as to make sure that they stay enrolled in schools. To protect vulnerable people, in 2017, Benin enacted a law promoting the rights of persons with disabilities, and we will soon be submitting our initial report on the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Women also continue to benefit from the protection of the government. In particular, an act was passed in order to crack down on gender-based violence and to protect women. It was adopted on the 20th of October 2021. This act grants enhanced protection to women, as well as more stringent punishments for sexual aggression, sexual harassment, rape, early marriage, genital mutilation, or aggravated violence. Moreover, the National Institute for the Promotion of Women, established in 2009, was reformed in 2021 and given an extended mandate to ensure